Perhaps like you, I have spent the last 2 weeks in deep sadness, mourning the deaths of all the innocent souls slaughtered in mass shootings at the hands of deranged individuals across our country. From the attack at the Tops Friendly Market in Buffalo, to the Geneva Presbyterian Church in Laguna Woods, California, to the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. In all, 32 murdered, 25 wounded, and countless others in relationship to each and every victim still, and perhaps now always, reeling in the wake of this unfathomable, but really quite fathomable terror. But you can't really begin to quantify such loss and destruction with just the numbers. If you spend the time to really sit with the numbers and to understand that each number represents a person, and then to learn about each person and consider their families, their circles, their histories, all their should have beens, from that which will never be or will never be the same. Quite frankly, for me at least, it feels like too much to bear. And I think that's because it is. In Judaism, we learn that each life is equal to a world in full. So the immensity of the destruction is truly too vast to even begin to reconcile. I often notice as a first impulse in myself a sense that we should just move on, because you know these things, they're inevitable now, an inextricable part of American life, and there's nothing we can do about it anyway. And yet, I take seriously the reminder of Abraham Joshua Heschel that radical amazement applies not just to that which is beautiful in the world, but also to that which is ugly. That we must never accommodate ourselves to the evil in our midst, no matter how regular it becomes. As such, when that feeling, that familiar feeling of overwhelm begins to set in within me, instead of simply accepting the status quo, I find myself going directly to rage. In particular, at the larger system that has allowed this to become an inextricable part of American life. Anything other, really, than to have to sit with the immense pain, grief, fear, and to be in that place for a while. Because a real and honest sitting with it would be uncomfortable. Not just for the presenting events that catalyze the feelings, but of course because also sitting with it with real time for reflection and consideration would necessarily call our attention to our already settled and reconciled overlooking of the scourge of violence that has come to describe so much of life today. Did you know that since May 1st here in Chicago, 43 people, 18 of them children, have been shot and killed? And 244 people, 68 of them children, have been shot and wounded? Did you know that the suicide and murder rates in America have skyrocketed over the past 2 years? Did you know that since 2020, the leading cause of death in children is guns? Not cancer, not drugs, guns. But whether a child is gunned down in their school, a grandparent in their grocery store, a worshiper in their church or their synagogue or their mosque, whether caught in gang crossfire or shot unintentionally by someone who happens upon a gun in a bedside table drawer, each and all point to a community and system-wide web of failure. It's a sickness, really, that seeped its way into every community, and no place is immune. Of course, the presenting matter is guns, the gun marketplace, politics, all that stuff. But let me say something most unpopular around these parts. This failure is not rooted in one singular cause. It is complicated. It's about human well-being, mental health, education, security, police, funding, accountability, emotional and impulse control, anger management, role modeling, race, wealth, class, early intervention, public health, the deterioration of social structures and communities, personal responsibility, and I could keep going. And the part no one really wants to say is that besides the fact that these solutions are complicated and will require sacrifices on all sides that no one seems willing to make, it's that each type of situation is not the same. And the solution for one, whatever that might be, will necessarily not be the same as the solution for another. There is no magic pill, there is no vaccine. We may think we will feel better by directing our rage and blame toward whomever the other side and viewpoint is, because of course, the entire reserve of accountability lies with them. But the truth is, doing that only widens the gap of dysfunction and moves us farther away from real solutions, whatever those might be, short, mid, long term, no less from each other. And here is the painful truth from which none of us can escape, no matter how much we might want to. Each of us, every one of us, is responsible for the state of affairs in which we find ourselves, and the only way out of it is all together. Something that at this moment in our country proves impossible. It's enough to plunge anyone into despair. I know it has for me. Ironically, I found a way to access some form of hope and possibility in a most unlikely place this week. This week we read one of the year's two most disturbing Torah portions. That's not a personal, subjective analysis. Bechukotai, the final portion in Leviticus, and its partner, Kitavo, one of the final portions in Deuteronomy, contains something called the Tochacha, the rebuke. It's an expansive list of curses that the Torah says will befall us should we stray from the right and holy path. The curse catalogs, as they're referred to in academic circles, feel reminiscent of Dante's Inferno and describe absolutely horrific, terrifying things that can or will happen to people. It's so terrifying, in fact, that from the time the Torah was read publicly, certain customs developed around the reading of these sections in an attempt to make them less confronting, less frightening. There are to be read in a quieter voice than normal, and read at a quicker pace. Even though it's considered an honor to read Torah, in practice, no community members ever wanted to be the readers of these portions and their confronting content. So the community leader or rabbi would by default have to read them instead. All of these and more reactions to the concern if that people were really to be forced to listen or heaven forbid say these words themselves, it would just be too much for them to handle. But there are a few records of communities over Jewish history that actually made a different choice. They made the choice to skip the reading of the Tochacha portions altogether because they decided for themselves that in their communities, listening to these words in any form was just too much to bear. Better to focus on the more palatable, simpler content in the portions, they believed. On this, the Rishonim and the Achronim, these are the rabbis of the 11th to 16th centuries, ruled in opposition, ultimately agreeing that because the content was in the Torah, no matter how uncomfortable one might be with it, it still had to be heard. It had to be confronted. Because in order to understand and be fully present and participatory in life, one can't only take note of the comfortable, beautiful parts. The brokenness, the pain, the injustice, all of that was and remains a part of life too. And if we want to be responsive to it, in particular to the parts we'd like to really change, we have to sit with it. We have to listen to it. We have to take it in. All of it. The rule goes on to say that this section of Torah can't be broken up into aliyot, or different sections. There are no reprieves from the Tochacha, so it's impossible not to confront it. That is, after all, the only way to reach discernment and clarity of purpose. Otherwise, all you get is surface reactivity and knee-jerk responsiveness, which yields, at best, empty social media postings with little to no real action, or at worst, increased acts of vigilante violence and destruction, none of which ultimately catalyze any sort of productive change. If you've been in my office, you've likely seen the bulletin board facing my desk covered with photos of my children. But on that bulletin board, there are other photos. There's a photo of Noah Posner, a 6-year-old Jewish boy who was killed at the Sandy Hook shooting in Newtown. A photo of Aliyah Shell, a 6-year-old girl who got caught in gang crossfire while sitting on her mother's lap on the porch of their little village home here in Chicago. There are others. And just this week, I pinned up a photo of Lexi Anaya Rubio, Amory Jo Garza, Tess Marie Matta, and Jose Flores, all 10-year-olds murdered in Uvalde. I placed them there next to my own kids to remind myself of my responsibilities to them every day, so that every day when I look up from my desk, I have to confront their faces and consider them. Every morning, I look at them, and every morning it takes my breath away. I hope that in response to these past few weeks, you have taken personal action to respond in the ways that are still possible. If you have not yet, you can still call your representatives to support common sense gun legislation, red flag laws, or whatever advocacy matters you believe may help. You can donate your time and money to support educational, health, social, and spiritual initiatives that address the root causes that lead to violence, and you can provide support to communities in the aftermath of violent occurrences. They all still need it, and if you don't know where to start, ask me. You can reach out to and take notice of the people in your life who seem isolated or alone. If you own a gun, you can make sure your firearms are stored unloaded and locked. You can be vigilant about your own training, and you can never give your children access to them. And if you see something, say something. These are all real, albeit small things each person can do. But more than any of that, I hope you will join me in not averting your eyes, not changing the channel and moving on, but rather taking the time to really sit with this tragedy, to feel the expansiveness of its reach. And only from there, perhaps we might discern a real way forward together. Shabbat Shalom.